but believing that somehow this very unique kind of grief that comes from a narcissistic relationship will simply fade away or heal in the same way other kinds of grief do, is often what creates even more pain for survivors of these relationships. Very often, it does not work like that. I want to offer you a deeper and more realistic way of understanding radical acceptance. Recently, I had the privilege of speaking with the respected Dr. Gabor Mate on the Dr. Ramani Network. He is a highly respected trauma and addiction specialist, and honestly, it was such an honor to have that conversation with him. We talked about many parts of emotionally abusive relationships and relational trauma, but he returned again to one idea that I have heard him say before and also read in his books, and I think it is important enough to repeat here because it matters so much. If you know his work, you have probably heard this before. But if you missed it, especially in relation to narcissistic relationships, here is the simple truth as he explains it. There is no pain-free path. That sentence is incredibly important. What does that really mean? It means that when you are healing from, surviving, or trying to navigate a narcissistic relationship, you have to understand that there is no perfect path, no easy path, and no completely right path. No matter what you choose, some part of it is going to hurt. And oddly enough, accepting that reality can help you become less stuck. Because many survivors stay frozen, asking themselves over and over, what is the right choice? What is the safest choice? What path hurts less? But there is no pain-free path. For example, in a romantic relationship with a narcissistic person, if you leave, they may immediately move on to another partner, maybe even before the relationship officially ends. They may publicly show off the new relationship. They may appear loving, charming, perfect, and deeply connected with the new person, and that can make you feel discarded, replaced, or deeply wounded. Or maybe after separation comes the smear campaign, the stalking, the manipulation, or the chaos involving money and child custody. But if you stay in the relationship, then you continue living through the same cycle, the same arguments, the same manipulation, the same gaslighting, the same emotional invalidation, the same emotional abuse, the same walking on eggshells every single day. In family relationships, it works the same way. If you continue showing up the way you always have, then you continue getting criticized, guilted, triangulated, shamed, manipulated, and emotionally exhausted. But if you step back or go low contact or no contact, then you may lose other family relationships too. You may feel isolated. You may lose your sense of belonging. You may be judged by society for stepping away from family. You may feel consumed by guilt and shame. So you begin to understand something very painful. Once you truly see the narcissistic relationship clearly for what it is, there really is no pain-free way forward. And that explains why radical acceptance feels so hard. People throw that phrase around casually, but in reality, it is deeply difficult. Because once you finally see the relationship clearly, you may think, wow, this already felt terrible. But now I also understand there is no easy way out either. And yes, both choices hurt. But understanding the patterns, seeing the emotional abuse clearly, understanding what it has done to you, understanding how much of yourself you had to abandon in order to stay connected to this relationship. All of that can eventually lead to something meaningful. It gives you a fighting chance to reconnect with your authentic self. It gives you the opportunity to stop abandoning yourself for the sake of keeping the relationship alive. It gives you the possibility of building healthier relationships in the future. But growth almost always comes with pain. That is the difficult truth. For many people, once they finally understand the narcissistic relationship, they suddenly feel pressure to act immediately. Now I see it clearly. I have to do something. And that awareness can bring shame, anger, sadness, and disgust towards yourself. Because now the mystery is gone. You can almost predict the next gaslighting episode, the next tantrum, the next betrayal. And strangely, losing the mystery also means losing hope. Hope was often the thing that kept the relationship going. That loss of hope becomes one of the hardest parts of radical acceptance. Many people ask me through social media, how do I bring up an issue with my narcissistic parent, spouse, sibling, partner, or friend without them getting angry or starting a fight? And the painful answer is usually this: you do not. That is radical acceptance. The conversation is probably going to become messy, defensive, chaotic, or emotionally exhausting. And many survivors stay stuck trying to discover the magical path that avoids conflict and pain. But there usually is not one. Ultimately, healing is not about choosing the path with less pain. It is about choosing the path that aligns with your truth, your values, your needs, and your growth. And sometimes that healthy choice may still mean staying in the relationship for now. But at least now you see it clearly. Now you are making the choice consciously instead of desperately hoping things are different than they are. When we stay in narcissistic relationships for a long time, we often lose our ability to trust our own choices because every option feels painful. Every choice seems to lead somewhere uncomfortable, so we freeze. Avoiding pain is natural. Human beings do it all the time. But avoiding pain also blocks growth. When you stand at the crossroads of a narcissistic relationship, asking yourself which path hurts less, that question itself may reflect the same stuckness you have always felt inside the relationship. And the reality remains the same. There is no pain-free path. But maybe understanding that gives you permission to finally make a real choice. Maybe it gives space for the real you, the part of yourself buried underneath years of manipulation, fear, guilt, and self-abandonment to finally emerge. So much energy gets wasted trying to find the cleaner path, the easier path, the less frightening path. But there usually is not one. As Dr. Mate says, there is no pain-free path. And once we stop fighting that truth, we can begin actively participating in our own healing instead of constantly hiding from pain. Because once we accept that pain is unavoidable, we can begin making choices that are actually right for us and for the people who depend on us, like our children. And when you finally make a choice and it still hurts, you may look back and wonder if the other option would have been easier. Maybe it would have been different, but it still would have carried pain. Now let us look at another difficult reality. People often say narcissistic people never change. But maybe the more important question is this: what exactly is it that you want to see change? Personality patterns tend to stay fairly stable throughout life. Healthier personalities have more flexibility. They may grow, become more self-aware, or improve with therapy and insight. But rigid personalities often stay rigid. Agreeable people usually remain agreeable. Responsible people usually remain disciplined. Chronically anxious people often stay anxious. And antagonistic people often remain difficult. And in narcissistic relationships, one of the hardest parts of radical acceptance is recognizing that the selfishness, entitlement, manipulation, gaslighting, blame shifting, emotional invalidation, lack of empathy, poor accountability, and emotional cruelty often do not significantly change. And to make things harder, narcissistic people usually do not even believe these traits apply to them. Could change happen? Maybe, if every possible factor lines up perfectly, if they truly commit to therapy, if they become vulnerable, if they develop self-awareness, if they are willing to face accountability consistently, if they have access to long-term treatment and truly want to do the work. But that is a very long list of conditions. And the painful truth is that most survivors stay in these relationships because they continue hoping change will happen. Then, when change does not happen, survivors blame themselves. They ask, what did I do wrong? Maybe I was too demanding. Maybe I was not patient enough. That is trauma bonding, cognitive dissonance, betrayal blindness, hope, fear, love, survival. So instead of asking the huge, overwhelming question, will narcissists ever change? Maybe ask yourself a more personal and practical question. What exactly do I need to change in order for this relationship to feel emotionally survivable for me? That answer is different for every person. Someone with an unfaithful partner may say, I just want the cheating to stop. Another person may say, I just want them to stop insulting me. Someone with an intrusive parent may say, I just want them to respect my boundaries. Someone with a toxic boss may say, I just want fair pay. The point is this: get specific. Not everyone can leave these relationships immediately. Not everyone even wants to leave. And staying does not automatically make someone weak, foolish, or codependent. Sometimes people stay because of health insurance, because of children, because of cultural expectations, because they are sick, because leaving would create even more instability, because there are other family members involved. And when you make that decision consciously, fully aware of reality, that is agency. That is different from denial. But clarity matters. And part of clarity means understanding which behaviors hurt you most deeply. Because maybe the narcissistic person will never become warm, compassionate, accountable, and emotionally healthy. But maybe there are smaller shifts that could slightly improve your day-to-day survival in the relationship. Maybe not, but clarity still matters. And if nothing changes, then the next question becomes this: can I realistically continue living with this exact pattern for years? That question becomes much more honest than endlessly hoping for total transformation. One of the hardest truths in narcissistic relationships is that you cannot safely reveal all your deepest emotional pain to the narcissistic person. Because once they know exactly what hurts you most, they often use it against you. So the thing you most need changed, that understanding is for you. And then you begin doing the only things that truly help in narcissistic relationships: disengaging more, taking the bait less often, not over-explaining yourself, not defending every detail, not sharing every vulnerability, and making sure you have spaces in your life where you are allowed to fully be yourself. Sometimes disengagement creates small improvements. Often it does not. But at least you begin seeing the relationship clearly, instead of drowning in confusion. And clarity is one of the biggest parts of healing, because then your decisions stop coming from fear, confusion, guilt, or fantasy. They begin coming from awareness. One of the biggest wounds survivors carry is this belief that they were stupid for believing the narcissistic person. You believed their promises. You believed their apologies. You believed the future faking. You believed they would finally change. Why? Because you loved them. Because you hoped. Because you cared. Because healthy people naturally want to believe the people they love. But after repeated betrayals, survivors usually do not say, "That person violated my trust." Instead, they say, "I was stupid for believing them." That self-blame becomes incredibly damaging. Believing someone you love is not stupidity. Trust is a normal part of human connection. Healing means slowly shifting from "I was foolish for trusting them" to "they were wrong for betraying my trust." And that shift takes time, because blaming ourselves strangely creates an illusion of control. If we are the problem, then maybe we can fix it. But the cost of that mindset is enormous. Over time, you begin seeing yourself as weak, naive, foolish, or broken. That is not true. Narcissistic relationships do not work because survivors are unintelligent. They work because survivors are capable of empathy, hope, attachment, loyalty, and compassion. And healing does not mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means learning how to care without abandoning yourself. Now let us talk about grief, because the grief inside narcissistic relationships is unlike most grief people understand. When someone dies, grief eventually changes shape. It never fully disappears, but over time, many people slowly build meaning around the loss. Narcissistic grief is different, because the relationship often keeps hurting you while everyone is still alive. And that creates a kind of grief that repeatedly reopens. You may think you are doing better. You may have a busy life. You may work constantly, stay productive, focus on healing, build routines, stay distracted, and then suddenly something small happens. A family gathering, a message, a memory, a social media post, a conversation with someone who had a healthy family. And suddenly, the grief crashes back in like an icy dagger. And what makes this grief so complicated is that radical acceptance does not remove the pain. It simply removes the shock. You may no longer be surprised by the manipulation, betrayal, criticism, or cruelty, but it still hurts. You grieve the years lost, the self you lost, the love you hoped for, the safety you never had, the family you wished existed, the version of life you imagined. And every new interaction can reactivate that grief again. That does not mean you are failing at healing. It means this kind of grief is ongoing, especially when contact continues through co-parenting, family systems, shared workplaces, or unavoidable life circumstances. And sadly, most people around you will not recognize this grief for what it is. They may say things like, well, they are still alive, or why can't you just move on already? But this is real grief. And when it rises again, the answer is not self-judgment. The answer is self-compassion. You slow down. You acknowledge it. You remind yourself that something deeply painful really did happen to you. This grief may never fully disappear while reminders continue existing. And that does not mean you are broken. It does not mean healing failed. Healing is messy. Healing is non-linear. Some seasons hurt more than others. And one of the most important things survivors can learn is this: the grief returning does not erase the healing you already did. Sometimes it simply means you are human. There is rarely closure in narcissistic relationships. There is usually no dramatic apology, no deep accountability, no movie-like ending where everything suddenly makes sense. That unresolved pain becomes part of the survivor experience. But when the grief appears again, you can learn to meet it differently. Instead of attacking yourself, you can say, "This hurt me. Of course this hurts." And that self-compassion matters deeply, because in many ways, you become the safe person for yourself that the relationship never allowed you to have. And maybe that is one of the deepest parts of healing. Not pretending the grief disappeared, but learning how to hold yourself gently when it returns. Remember this: there is no closure in a narcissistic relationship, and there is no pain-free path. But there can still be healing, clarity, self-respect, and growth. Thanks again.